Imagine this, your home is underwater. The rain hasn't stopped in days, the river has burst its banks, and everything you've built, your memories, your photos, your children's toys are floating away. Your kids are shivering, terrified, and you do the one thing every American has been taught to do in a crisis. You pick up the phone and call FEMA, the cavalry, the government's emergency lifeline. But this time, nobody answers. Not because the system collapsed, not because the lines were jammed, but because the person in charge of Homeland Security wouldn't let FEMA do its job. That's not a nightmare. That's reality under Secretary Kristi Noem, and it's why Senator Peter Welch walked onto the Senate floor and said the words no one wanted to hear but everyone needed to.
Security has an extremely important mission: keep Americans safe. And under that mission, the department is tasked with two critical jobs: border security and disaster response. Mr. President, our current Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, has failed both. In her short tenure, Secretary Noem has overstepped, underperformed, and endangered the lives of countless Americans. Mr. President, I believe it is time for Secretary Noem to resign or for her to be fired. Mr. President, Secretary Noem has undermined FEMA's work, and in so doing endangered disaster victims. Just a few months ago, Secretary Noem said in a cabinet meeting, and I quote, "We are eliminating FEMA." And she meant it. She meant it. And we saw evidence of that in what happened in not just in Texas, but in North Carolina, New Mexico, California, Kentucky, Hawaii, Vermont, where FEMA is absolutely crucial to helping people and communities and businesses recover from disaster. We need FEMA. And it's only the resources of the federal government that can surge resources into affected communities. And we can't lose that function and that capacity. When you need safety from a flood, when you need to start the long road to recovery, you need the support of the federal government. No state, no community cannot do this alone. But Mr. President, I have seen from our experience in Vermont that FEMA, in fact, must be reformed. It must not be destroyed, as Secretary Noem has suggested. My view, we cannot have a leader in charge of FEMA that is committed to its destruction. We must have one who is energetically committed to its reform. And we have seen the result of Secretary Noem's indifference to FEMA as the catastrophe in Texas unfolded. As the waters rose along the Guadalupe River in Hill Country, it was the people of Hill Country, as my colleague, Representative Chip Roy of Texas said, who responded heroically. They were saving lives, they were rescuing stranded children, they were comforting those who lost loved ones, and they provided material assistance and constant support. As for FEMA, it didn't answer the phone. Secretary Noem had instituted a policy to micromanage FEMA to death. And under Secretary Noem's watch, FEMA instituted a new policy that required the Secretary's signature on any expense more than $100,000, which at the time of a major catastrophe is a very small amount. Secretary Noem had an eyes wide open awareness that this policy would mean it would take, quote, a minimum of 5 days for front office review. In a disaster, you do not have 5 days. Contractors for FEMA answered the vast majority of calls, about 3,000, from flood victims on July 5th. But according to news reports, after contracts with those companies were allowed to lapse, that response rate fell to 36% on July 6th, and then only 16% on July 7th, when people needed someone to answer the phone. FEMA left 13,793 calls unanswered. In the aftermath of disaster, people cannot wait for help. Many are homeless or living in very dangerous conditions. Search and rescue teams were waiting to be deployed. Disaster recovery centers were slow to open. Current and former FEMA employees have raised the alarm about how slow the federal government was to respond and support Texas. We can reform FEMA in very common sense ways, and we must, but we cannot risk the lives of countless Americans under the mismanagement of a secretary who's called for its elimination. But there's a second reason Secretary Noem must resign. She's failing our country on immigration. Mr. President, we have three fundamental issues on immigration: border security, the deportation of criminals, and the status of people who are here without legal status, but are working, they're paying taxes, in many cases have families, and have no criminal record. Mr. President, I want to step back for a minute and acknowledge something that too many Democrats have been too slow to state. The United States does need a secure border, and President Trump has largely accomplished that. In December 2023, there were 249,740 illegal crossing arrests between official ports of entry. That was an all-time high. Last month, that number dwindled to 6,070 illegal border crossing arrests. And I give President Trump credit for that change. The second issue is that undocumented immigrants who have committed serious crimes should be.
Kristi Noem must resign. Texas, Hill Country, a flood that turned neighborhoods into lakes, highways into rivers, and homes into graveyards. Families stranded on rooftops, children swept away, entire communities begging for help. FEMA should have been there. They weren't. Here's the cold truth. On July 5th, FEMA contractors answered about 3,000 calls from desperate flood victims. But after contracts expired, contracts Noem's office knew were expiring, the response rate collapsed. The next day, only 36% of calls were answered. By July 7th, it fell to 16%. 13,793 calls for help ignored. Imagine being one of those callers. Your home gone, your loved ones missing, and the only thing you get is a deadline. This wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. FEMA wasn't overwhelmed, FEMA was chained, and the person holding the key was Kristi Noem. In a move that stunned FEMA veterans, Noem issued a policy requiring her personal approval for any FEMA expenditure over $100,000. Now in a disaster zone, $100,000 doesn't go far. That's a few generators, a couple hundred cots, portable toilets for evacuees. By forcing every expenditure onto her desk, Noem guaranteed delays. Days, not hours. 5 whole days, minimum, before FEMA could sign off on help. 5 days when every second mattered. When pressed, FEMA insiders revealed she knew exactly what this policy would mean. She said it anyway. She defended it anyway. And in a cabinet meeting, she took it even further. We are eliminating FEMA. Her words. Not speculation, not rumor. Her words. So while Texans begged for rescue, FEMA's cavalry was locked in the stable. But this wasn't just about disaster relief. Because while Noem was strangling FEMA, she was building something else. A theater, a stage. And her favorite props? Immigrant families. You might think DHS's job is to prioritize dangerous criminals, deporting those who threaten safety. But under Noem, that line blurred. Instead of focusing on criminals, she authorized indiscriminate raids. Schools, workplaces, churches. Construction sites shut down mid-shift. Healthcare workers disappeared from hospitals. Farmers left without laborers to milk their cows or pick their crops. Communities suddenly hollowed out, not because of crime but because Noem wanted numbers. As Senator Welch explained, she wasn't targeting the dangerous. She was targeting the available. People with families, jobs, and in some cases even legal status. This wasn't security. It was spectacle. And like any show, spectacle needs funding. Big funding. Which brings us to the money trail. If you thought these policies were about efficiency, brace yourself. Noem greenlit a $200 million ad campaign starring herself. Yes, you heard that right. Instead of deploying resources to disaster zones, she approved commercials praising her department's work and warning migrants to leave. Not law enforcement, not relief, just propaganda. She spent $21 million transporting 400 migrants to Guantanamo Bay. That's $55,000 per person, a figure so outrageous that even critics on both sides shook their heads. And many of those migrants, they weren't even kept at the facility. They were quickly transferred. Imagine what that money could have done. Hundreds of shelters, thousands of meals, paychecks for frontline officers, relief for struggling towns. Instead, it padded ad agencies and created photo ops. And speaking of photo ops, Noem loves them. She's been photographed in ICE uniforms, Border Patrol uniforms, military jackets, parading around as if the Department of Homeland Security were her personal costume closet. At the Vermont-Canada border, in a library that straddles the line between the two countries, she literally jumped across the border shouting 51st State, as if mocking Canada were a game. For Vermonters whose tourism and trade depend on that relationship, it wasn't a joke, it was an insult. She's posed with detained migrants, turning human beings into backdrops. She staged ICE raids as though they were political rallies, and all of it served one purpose: to project herself, not to protect America. It was only a matter of time before someone in power said what millions were already thinking, that someone was Senator Welch. On the Senate floor, Welch laid it bare. Secretary Noem has failed both immigration and disaster response. He didn't say it with flourish. He said it with evidence. Thousands of unanswered FEMA calls, families left stranded, farmers robbed of their workforce, taxpayer dollars wasted on vanity ads and political theater. Welch called it a moral reckoning. Because this isn't just about numbers, it's about people. People who lost homes in floods, people who lost jobs in raids, people who lost faith in a government that's supposed to protect them. And his conclusion was damning. Noem is not fit for office. She must resign. Now you might be thinking that's politics, that's Washington. But let's make it personal. Next time there's a fire, a tornado, a flood, who do you call? FEMA. And what happens if FEMA can't answer because the secretary cut the lines? Next time your community hospital is short-staffed, or your local construction project stalls, ask yourself why. Ask who authorized those workplace raids. Ask who turned neighbors into numbers. This isn't distant. It's here. It's your town, your family, your safety. The truth is simple. FEMA exists so no American faces disaster alone. No child should sit in a car hungry and cold because their house is gone. No elderly couple should lose power to their oxygen machine while Washington plays politics. But under Kristi Noem, that safety net is being shredded. And every storm, every fire, every flood makes the danger clearer. Senator Welch is right. This is not leadership. This is sabotage dressed up as governance. And if it continues, the next disaster won't just be dangerous, it could be deadly. So here's the call to action. If you're outraged, don't sit quiet. Share this story. Talk about it. Call your senator. Demand accountability. Because America deserves leaders who save lives, not sacrifice them for television time. And as the waters rise, as the fires burn, as the winds tear through our towns, remember this: the cavalry should always answer. And if Kristi Noem stays in charge, the cavalry might never come.